Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast. This is Adam Strutz. And as always, before we delve into today's discussion, I want to encourage you to click on the link in the description to make a contribution to the work of the Afrikaner Foundation, which also will help in sustaining and growing this podcast. As I have mentioned before, we do not want to put advertisements on this podcast, which is why it's so important for us to make sure that we get contributions from viewers or listeners such as yourself who support this podcast and the work that we are doing. Now, in today's episode, I had a fantastic conversation with Jeremy Cole, the author of the book The Unprotected Class, a book that deals with the extent to which anti-white racism is destroying America. Now, talking about anti-white racism in itself is already controversial, which is one of the facts that Jeremy Cole points out in his book. Now, speaking about this from a South African perspective is, of course, very interesting because, from our perspective, some of the issues and the concerns that Cole raises in his book is much worse in South Africa. But on the other hand, there are some aspects of this issue that is much worse in America. So it does seem that there is much that we can learn from each other, that we can learn from each other's experiences. And what is especially striking and fantastic about Cole's book is that it's not only an evaluation or a discussion about the problem, but it also contains a list of practical things that people can do to combat racism consistently, and also policy ideas that ought to be implemented to deal with this issue. We will get to that by the end of the discussion. Now, I should warn you, if you are watching this podcast on YouTube, we had some technical difficulties as far as the video is concerned, some connectivity issues. The audio is still fine, so if you are watching, you will see, especially in the beginning of the podcast, there was some staggering initially, but the audio and the content is still very good. But for now, let's go to our conversation with Jeremy Cole. All right, Jeremy Cole, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
So I have a copy of your book, The Unprotected Class, with me, and it was a fascinating read. As you know, I also wrote a review on Politics Web, which is an South African website, and it's on Substack as well. And it's very striking reading this book about anti-white racism in America, but from a South African perspective, because as you know, we have our own challenges when it comes to the fight against racism. But maybe a good introductory question could be, you start the book with some disclaimers. You start by saying that, please know that if you read this book, rest assured that I'm not saying that there were no atrocities in the past, and I'm not saying that white racism is not a problem, and all of these things. And we do the same thing in South Africa when we talk about these issues. And so the point is that technically or theoretically it shouldn't be necessary to make such disclaimers, but we have to do the same and you have to do the same. So why is it necessary to start a book about racism by explaining, please just understand that I'm not a racist when I talk about this?
Yeah, Ernst, that's a great question. And I suspect it's slightly different in our cases, but it kind of goes to, I think, something a little bit deep within white Western psychology almost. I think in South Africa, perhaps, it's a little more understandable in that whites are still a small minority, relatively speaking. I mean, a substantial one, but by no means the majority. And therefore, of course, I mean, I think there's many kind of motivations that go on, but one is obviously you don't want to antagonize the majority population in an unnecessary way. For white Americans, it's a little bit less clear, other than kind of resorting to a psychological explanation of why all the throat clearing is going on. I think at one level to kind of maybe be charitable to myself. It's simply, I want to kind of start on the basis of people understanding I'm not trying to kind of pretend that nothing bad happened in American history or that there's no other types of racism. I mean, that I'm not kind of writing some extremist book. At the same time, it is sort of strange that we have to be so apologetic as a white majority in the United States, in a country that's really, built quite a lot, for simply advocating that we not be discriminated against. And I think but I can tell you, it shows something deep in the psychological makeup, even of American conservatives, that sort of disclaimer is always necessary.
Yeah. So in the book, we spoke about this. You actually mentioned something that I was involved with, even though you don't mention me by name. But you talk about racism in other countries and how it's dealt with, and then you mentioned also big tech's response to racism. And there was a public hearing in South Africa hosted by the South African Human Rights Commission, where I did a presentation several years ago, and the presentation was about double standards in dealing with racism. And so I mentioned some examples in this presentation about some prominent examples of black people making racist comments or behaving in a racist way, and white people doing the same, and then how society, or how especially the media and the government, responds differently. And so it was the speech was a call for double standards, but the speech was taken off Google. It was disincentivized. Or if you look for it on Google, you don't find it. And so is this but you say that this is a regular thing. It's something that we should be really concerned about, the way big tech companies are trying to deal with issues of race.
Absolutely. And it goes to sort of politics more broadly. I literally sort of picked up, I go to Google News this morning, so I usually use that. I probably shouldn't, as my kind of news homepage. And there was a lot of coverage of the Trump Madison Square Garden rally as the main thing. And it was just all ridiculously slanted toward the left. But obviously you see this on race in particular. Certain things about race are kind of hidden as results. Your case was obviously a particularly dramatic example of that, but I think a lot of other cases, the algorithm is just being tweaked in subtle ways to provide a political result that the leftists who run Google or Microsoft Bing or whatever it might be want. And I think there's a number of things that are concerning about that. One of them is just that it's being done at all. But the second is the total lack of transparency. I mean, we don't even see that. And so a really sophisticated person may kind of recognize that something is going on here. But in many cases, the average person who's interacting with these simply doesn't know what they don't know. They may think they're searching for something that is unbiased, but in fact, they're getting a very biased presentation.
And so, I mean, other examples I'm sure the viewers or the listeners would have experienced this in some ways is AI generated images, for example. When you say, create me an image of George Washington, you get an image of a black man as George Washington and so forth. Yeah. So we have all these strange examples. And you see that with families as well. For example, I uploaded a picture to an AI site of my children in the kitchen, busy preparing food, and I asked, make me a cartoonish image of my children, and I said it's a family, it's my children, and so the picture I got was a multiracial family suddenly, and it was sort of, the algorithm is written in such a way, it seems, that it has to present things in a certain way, and then we see that with what's happening in Hollywood today as well, with films coming out and the way historical events are being depicted and so forth. So this has really become a trend, and it doesn't seem that it's going to be reversed at some point. Or what do you think?
No, I don't think it will, without the right getting much more serious about exercising power. And again, this is more of a U.S. answer because in South Africa you have a different situation. Yeah. But I'm writing a piece right now on that I was commissioned to write on, like, what should Trump do if he wins? By the time this shows, that may or may not be relevant, but hopefully it will be relevant. And what I'm going to kind of say is, the thing I worry most about is that I don't actually think he's going to do all of the bad stuff that the left says he's going to do. I think he should, because not because I want to, wreak horrific vengeance for some psychological need that I have on our political opponents, but just because the political opponents, so many of them have done things that are completely contrary to our democratic traditions, our democratic norms, to free speech, to, the kind of outrageous libels, the lawfare. And if you don't have a consequence for those things, then fine, they lost the election, they'll just be back doing it again. And so I do worry, and I worry about this in a racial context too, which is if you simply let, and I mentioned this in the book, I mean, if you kind of just let anti-white racism just fester, and the only consequences are when the right is in power, it's just kind of lessened, that doesn't really do much for you. What you have to do is actually punish it. You actually have to punish the racists, for their racist behavior. You can't simply just kind of let it slide, and that involves a level of confrontation. The right in America is still a little bit mixed about whether they have the stomach for that type of confrontation. Mm-hmm. But if anybody's going to do it, I'm hopeful that the Trump administration may.
So I remember watching that clip on, I think it was Jimmy Fallon, who spoke about he mentioned sort of in passing on his show that new census data is out and white people are now less than 50% in America, and then the audience started cheering and applauding. And and so the question then is, and this is a short question that probably deserves a very long answer, but why has anti-white racism become politically correct?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, I think there's some deep psychological things going on. I think that, there are things about democracies and what happens when cultures get too comfortable that are going on. There are certain, I think, elements of guilt within Christianity. And I say this, I mean, I'm a Calvinist myself, so it's not that I'm running away from that as a useful thing for us to think that we're sinners, because we are. But I think that can sometimes be hijacked by bad actors and made to go much further than it really should. So I think that some of that comes into play. I think changing demographics have come into play. So, if America were still basically in my youth, and I'm only 50, I'll be 52 later this year. When I was born, America was almost 90% white non-Hispanic, as opposed to about 58% today. If we had the demographics of my youth in this country, I think we'd be having very different types of conversations. I think some of this ridiculousness would not go on. But look, the reality is there's now a lot of constituencies that kind of benefit from this type of discourse, at least in the short term. And so I think that's one of the things that's pushing it. But as you point out, it's a short question that has a long answer, and in my case, almost a book-length answer.
Yeah. So I want to get your view on the extent to which America is sort of the ideological breeding ground for this. And so on this podcast, an earlier episode we had was about a phenomenon that is in South Africa known as Azanian critical theory. Now, Azania is sort of the leftist term for South Africa, and it's the South African version of critical race theory. And it's very much taken from critical race theory in America, but it's sort of been South Africanized. And so what we see, at least in our perspective, is how these ideas are coming from America and then sort of being shaped or molded in a particular way to fit the South African context. But then we also had a phenomenon in America that actually started in South Africa, which was the targeting of statues and heritage sites and so forth. We had that, it started with the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in Cape Town in South Africa, where activists started targeting the statue of Cecil John Rhodes. And then this idea of throwing statues with feces and setting it alight and tearing it down. And that sort of then spread to the rest of the world. So what's your comments on the way in which countries are sort of influencing each other on this?
Yeah, it is kind of almost a cultural death spiral. And again, I actually get the question quite a bit. Is America kind of going to go the way of South Africa on these questions? And I always hesitate a little bit because I think primarily our demographics are just so different, right? And there's no, and I recognize that even within South Africa's non-white population, there's a variety of different, groups, whether it be Zulus or Cape Colored or, whatever have you. So I'm not trying to make them all a monolith, but to say nothing of Afrikaners, which I believe are, certainly no more than about half of white South Africans. But white South Africans themselves are a fairly small minority. Then you get to Afrikaners as a minority of a minority. So there's no, even with out of control mass immigration, I don't think there's any prospect that that's kind of in the immediate future of the U.S. So I think it's different in that way. But I do think that leftists in America have sort of started this intellectual phenomenon, and then it kind of spreads to South Africa, and it kind of, that feeds on itself, and it kind of comes back. And I think, again, a lot of the simplistic narrative that has been, put forth in the West about the apartheid era in South Africa, again, it kind of just feeds into this. And then we saw the sort of extreme of that in what happened, in Rhodesia, where, essentially, you don't need me and your listeners presumably don't need me to tell you what happened there, right? But ultimately that led to a catastrophe for both white and black people living in what's now Zimbabwe. And so obviously that's something that in America and presumably also in South Africa, we would like to avoid repeating that at all costs.
Yeah. Yeah, there are these clips online when Robert Mugabe took power in in Zimbabwe. People cheering, saying how the country has now been liberated and how this utopia is ahead for Rhodesia, and it turns out it didn't work out that way. I want to get your view on diversity and immigration, because this is actually a nuanced topic. Because we hear this common saying today, diversity is a strength, and it has sort of become a trope almost. And we respond to that by saying that, well, isn't unity supposed to be a strength? But there's some truth in saying that diversity is a strength, that immigration is a good thing, and that different people can contribute in different ways to strengthening a society. Right. But it has gone completely off the rails in a place like America. So where's the balance on something like immigration and diversity?
Right. And I would just argue we're just badly on the wrong side of that balance. I mean, obviously, America is a country. We're not a nation of immigrants. This is something I point out in my book, the kind of propaganda nature of that historical phrase. But obviously, we're a nation that has had a great deal of immigration over time, even since nationhood, and that those folks and their descendants have obviously contributed a great deal to America. But I think we're just, I guess, again, the question is what immigrants, how many of them, what are they bringing? To name one famous South African immigrant, Elon Musk brought quite a lot of nice things to America. And right now, the sort of, there's been, the left has been kind of running with the notion I guess there was some gray area about his visa at some point early on in his entrepreneurial career. And the left is making great hay out of this. And, it's so stupid that you almost hesitate to respond to it. But, my kind of notion is I'm not worried about immigrants who graduate from Penn and then get into a doctoral program at Stanford and then leave the program, a couple days and then may have a gray area. I mean, this is not the threat to America. And to kind of conflate that with the sort of invasion over the southern border of whether it be Haitians or folks from South America or folks from Afghanistan, who are unvetted, it's absurd, right? So clearly, at times, the immigration can be beneficial to society, but it also matters a lot about who is immigrating and in what volume, and that's not a discussion that the left in America ever wants to have.
Yeah. So the tragedy about Elon Musk's story. Him having grown up in South Africa, he grew up actually not far from where I'm sitting. He went to boys' high school here in Pretoria, went to America, and now we don't have Starlink in South Africa. And the big reason, therefore, it's because it's not black owned, and so the South African government is discriminating against him on a race basis, of course, at the expense of everyone in the country. So it's really bizarre, this whole phenomenon.
No, absolutely. And it points out, I mean, again, that's not the failures of the modern rainbow nation are something that obviously you're very aware of given your situation. But the average American, and I'm not even talking about a leftist, I'm just talking about your average American, you were to pull up on the street to the extent they would think about South Africa at all. My sense is they just have no real sense of what is going on there, of the fact that the solution to discrimination is not discrimination in the opposite, and to the explosion of crime. I mean, all this stuff is just, there's only a positive, happy rainbow nation narrative that you're allowed to have in America about South Africa. And again, I mean, I think folks on the right who are active are certainly aware that the reality is, shall we say, more nuanced than that. But look, I mean, the media apparatus is really powerful with its propaganda, and for most people who don't have the time to pay a lot of attention, that's kind of the message they're getting.
So one of the points you mention in the book, with reference to Michael Anton, is this celebration parallax, which maybe you should explain it. What is the celebration parallax, and how does it transpire? And can you give some examples of this?
Sure. So the celebration parallax is essentially, I mean, it's from an audio, a reference to a visual phenomenon where you sort of see things differently from different perspectives. And the kind of executive summary of it is effectively, it's not happening, and it's good that it is. So that's kind of the executive summary. So if, as an American, I point out that there's a bunch of unvetted, uncontrolled immigration coming over our southern border, and then maybe that's not good, we'll sort of be attacked for that. And then in the next breath, and if I were to say something like the Great Replacement, I mean, that's like a big taboo, with the left. It gets very angry if you sort of say Americans are being replaced, or even more that white Americans are being replaced. But yet in the next breath, they'll go on a campaign tour, and they'll celebrate. They'll maybe use a different term, but they'll say, the increasingly diverse nation, and isn't this wonderful? And you're sort of expected to just kind of not notice that they are telling you this. So that is the kind of celebration parallax. And again, it's just all these double standards. And I see at least my own role on the right, but even the role on the right more generally at this point is simply to just point out these double standards as forcefully as we can, not because the left is going to be sympathetic. They're not going to change their behavior. They, if they had any, if they didn't have double standards, they'd have no standards at all. But at least we need to kind of make our own side aware of what is going on. And so, I mean, it's just an education process right now.
And so part of this celebration parallax is also, it's determined by who says it. So one example in America, and correct me if I'm wrong, is if Joe Biden says that he's going to make sure that his VP candidate, which was Kamala Harris back then, is a woman of color, that is celebrated. And then if someone points out that she was chosen because she's a woman of color, you get attacked and accused of conspiracy theories for saying that. But we have many such examples in South Africa. One I can think of now is when the South African government started this process to try to change the South African constitution to empower the state to take private property without compensation. The president said that they are going to do this because by taking private property, they want to create the Garden of Eden in South Africa. And it was reported in the media. And when I pointed that out, when I said the president says that he wants to create the Garden of Eden, I was quite viciously attacked for saying that. So it depends on who's saying it. If this person says it, then it's celebrated. Yeah. If this person says the exact same thing, then you get attacked for it.
No, that's absolutely right. And some people are allowed to say things and other people are not. And so these are huge problems, these double standards. And even, again, the Trump administration, I think Trump has in general run a really, really good campaign in the wake of just ferocious everything the state and the regime could throw at him. But I think the one mild frustration I have is that he hasn't totally broken through that. And, sort of unashamedly, I literally posted something on X this morning that Kamala Harris is out on the trail right now. And these articles are being written unashamedly about how she's appealing to black Hispanic voters. But if Trump were to go and do an appeal to white voters, I'm not to say that he wouldn't want other people's votes, but just that he would make that appeal, that would be like Hitler, right? And the campaign still hasn't totally broken out of that mode, even when they've addressed, I think, real problems that are facing white Americans. And they've done that a lot, particularly white working class Americans. And that's been a lot of the base of his support. But he hasn't necessarily always built that into a coherent narrative. It's more been piecemeal, like, I don't like this, I don't like this, I don't like this. But he still doesn't want to name kind of the overarching phenomenon that's going on. And look, I understand that, because he's going to get, hit ferociously as he often is. But I do think that it's important to kind of air these things directly.
Yeah. So in a way, we're trying to play the game on the table as it has been set for us. And it does seem, looking at America and South Africa as well, of course, that it used to be that being a racist is pretty much the worst thing that you can be, which is why being accused of racism or being accused of being a racist is something really bad. Yeah. But now these accusations are so common that people just don't care about it anymore. And it seems like what's happening now is the accusation of racism has now become accusations of Nazism. It's strange to see how often people get accused of being Nazis at the moment.
Yeah, well, and this just again happened with Trump's Madison Square Garden last night. And again, this is not just weird people on Twitter. This is like MSNBC, which is a major U.S. Cable network, kind of running these pieces. Meanwhile, there's all of these observant religious Jews who are actually at the rally, right? So there's a certain absurdity to it. At the same time, and this is, again, something I touch on in the Unprotected Class, the book, racism obviously being a bad thing, just stipulating no matter who's engaged in it. I'm almost wary, and I was almost wary in writing the book, in kind of reifying it too much as like the only thing we should care about. And that, I could imagine a government that was slightly racist against me, but that allowed me really good free speech, that allowed me, a really great business environment, that allowed me a great deal of freedom of association and other things, that I would still say, on balance, that might be a better government for me than a government that didn't discriminate me by race, but it did not allow me freedom of speech. It did not allow me freedom of association. It was fully socialist. So there's a certain level in which, even in trying to describe this phenomenon, which is very concerning, I was a little wary that I don't want to just say like, well, if you're racist, that's like the only thing that matters, because there's a lot of other things that matter about good governance, even though obviously we don't want racism of any type. To kind of have this sort of one-note simplistic discussion of racism is really the left's tactic. And so we just do need to have some degree of wariness about that.
I mean, this is very alarming, but you also seem to be quite concerned about the extent to which critical race theory and these ideologies have infiltrated not only universities, but also schools. Is this something that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, absolutely. And critical race theory and its sort of, less virulent, but in some ways, because they're slightly hidden, even more toxic derivatives are ubiquitous in our social institutions, in our schools. And these aren't just a question of demographics. My kids, who are going to a government school in an area that is frankly like one of the whitest areas of the entire United States. I mean, I think, that school system is probably 90+% white, but they're still getting a lot of the same critical race theory type things that you would get in other parts of America, because the teachers' colleges, that's what they're sort of teaching these teachers, and they're all leftists, and they come out and you have to celebrate diversity in every single one of its manifold ways. And at some point, there was a small parents revolt in the place that I live, and they kind of calmed down some of the worst elements of it. But it's kind of an eternal vigilance that's needed. And of course, in the university system, we have this sort of thing on steroids. It's really bad. It's concerning. And I think there's been a more organized pushback now. But I think what we see, unfortunately, with the left is they don't ever retreat. They just kind of retrench. So I guess I should put that they're making a strategic retreat because they realize they took a little bit more territory than they could hold right now. But as demographics change and everything else, they'll be back, and they'll want more over time. It's foolish to think that we are winning this battle right now. We're not.
And so what I like about your book and your approach is you're not just discussing the problem, you're not just screaming there's a fire, you're actually saying how do we fight the fire, how do we combat it. So maybe let's talk about that. I think you talk about some practical things that we or that people can do, but then you also talk about policy ideas. So maybe let's just talk about some of the practical things that people can do. What do you think we should be doing to fight this situation?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's funny because I've had so many great reviews of the book, and the only one partially negative review that I had was from a kind of soft conservative who was very upset with me for sort of saying that part of one solution is that I thought protests where we were actually out in the street is actually useful. And by that, I'm not suggesting that we sort of engage in Black Lives Matter style hooliganism, but that there is a power to kind of being in a crowd, to, and the left realizes this, to sort of being out and having that type of nonviolent demonstration, just to show that you're not alone out there. So I do think that that's an element of it. There are a million other sort of solutions that I talk about in the book, everything from various cross-racial alliances to fight against these types of discrimination. I think that for example, there's a lot of areas in which whites and Asian Americans in the United States have a lot of commonality of interest. I talk about engaging in lawfare against some of the discriminatory elements of the regime. We already had a major Supreme Court decision that essentially has outlawed affirmative action in American universities. So I do think that there's a lot of things that we can do substantively to kind of ban discrimination, to get rid of what's called disparate impact policy. I'd love to have the opportunity to maybe do this if we're fortunate enough to get a Trump administration to work on some of these issues. But it's kind of a long slog to get everything done that we need to get done.
So from a policy perspective, what would you say are the most important things that ought to be done to try to bring things back into balance?
Yeah, so I think one is to just get rid of all, I mean, again, we call it affirmative action in the U.S. I know you have a different name for it in South Africa, but we need to kind of get rid of basically, John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, put it very nicely many years back, which is effectively, he said, the way to stop discriminating against Americans by race is to stop discriminating against Americans by race. So we just need to simply stop all racial discrimination of all types publicly sanctioned in the United States. It's not exclusively anti-white. Some of it actually works against Asian Americans right now. And there are probably some weird instances in which other groups are affected even by official discrimination today. But so you just need to ban that. We need to ban it in hiring. We need to ban it in universities. That's a great deal of what happens. We need to remove disparate impact doctrine, which is probably going to require a Supreme Court victory. This is essentially a doctrine that basically, I'm oversimplifying it for any lawyers who might be listening, so don't jump down my throat. But basically, when you have a reference population and that reference population is sort of among the applicants to a job, and then you kind of wind up with a candidate pool that you actually select of your successful candidates, and it looks really different demographically from the underlying racial population. Under disparate impact doctrine, you can be said it has a disparate impact on those groups. And even if there is no shown intent to discriminate, you can be found guilty of illegal discrimination. Well, this has an incredibly pernicious view on American hiring. And so there's a long sort of Supreme Court history of this going back to 1971, but it's completely contrary to American traditions. It needs to be sort of pulled out, root and branch. So those are some of the primary things I think we should be doing on that side of the ledger. And then also I think we've got to get control of our border. It's not a direct thing, but until we kind of stop the kind of mass invasion of the country, and also bringing in lots of people who under our current system, they show up at the border, and as soon as they get in here, they and their children are going to be legally advantaged in many ways. over, say, my kids, that's just going to create a huge number of problems. And so I'd say those are sort of all high priority areas for us to engage with.
Well, Jeremy Cole, thank you very much for joining us on the Pioneer Podcast. It was a good discussion, and I think there's so much to flesh out here, but we really appreciate your inputs.
Thanks so much. And, we always watch what's going on over there with interest, and I wish you guys really good luck as you're sort of dealing with many of your own challenges in South Africa.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Adam Strutz. If you support this podcast and the work that we are involved with as the Afrikaner Foundation and the broader solidarity movement in South Africa, I want to encourage you to become a more active supporter. You can do this first and foremost by subscribing to our various social media channels, by leaving a comment and sharing what you have seen. But other than that, also by making a small monthly contribution to the work that we are doing through the Afrikaner Foundation's website, or by making a once-off donation. Links in the description.